Hello and welcome to Argumentor podcast, the podcast to discuss, debate, and deliberate on various contemporary social, legal, and political issues. We adduce various arguments and counter the same from different perspectives. I myself, Joel, and with me is Minhaaj. Say hi.
Hello guys, I'm Minhaaj and I hope to give you a fruitful discussion, fruitful session today.
And joining with me is Maria.
Hello everybody, Maria here.
Thank you and thank you. The following episode, we will be covering about free speech in particular, and uh, and today we are termed our podcast as our speechless opinions on free speech. We will be covering about the emergency, the social media, and other platforms as well with regard to the free speech. Also, do check us out on Spotify, Anchor, iTunes, and on YouTube as well. And before we proceed, we thank you for supporting us in our previous episodes where we dealt with the Indo-China dispute, our hashtag Hindi Chini Bye Bye. Thank you for all the love, and we have seen your comments and appreciate y'all. 3 comments in particular, and thank you so much. Also, a comment saying, Maria, please fix your mic. So please spam on the comment section with Maria, buy a new mic because her mics are making a lot of noise also. So. But jokes aside, we all need to upgrade our equipment. So we need you guys to tune into our podcast regularly. This is a weekly podcast, and as the name suggests, we are a platform to adduce various arguments and counter the same by reflecting on various perspectives we all have. So are we all ready to set to go?
Yes, sure.
Sure. And thank you, Maria. I'm from Minaj, very feeble one from Minaj, so I hope it's a yes.
Yeah, let's proceed.
Yeah. So, when we think about free speech in particular, and our basic opinions about on free speech, we first think about the very famous quote by Rabindranath Tagore, and I quote, "Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-wide thinking and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake." You get the basic notion, but the harsh truth is...
Joel, I would like to interrupt you here. Don't you think that poem is a bit too utopian for today's times?
You're absolutely correct, because, we all day long we talk about the principle of free speech and freedom of expression, and also the Constitution guaranteeing us these rights. But are we really are we really allowed to say so many things? Is that really freedom of speech and expression? I would really like to get you guys on board with regard to the current topic, and in particular, do you guys remember about the emergency? Do we really know of anything, any accounts of it with regard to the free speech in particular, and also a historical aspect of free speech?
I think nobody ever will be unaware of the issue of emergency, like whether it's our generation or any coming generations, because I think it was one of the biggest ever infringement of a person's right to free speech in particular that the whole country has ever seen. So I think that's a very valid point to elaborate on when we actually come up with a topic like this, like everybody would have a great interest in. Minaj, do you have some insights on emergency period?
Yeah, sure. The emergency period was a period where, the pillars of democracy were just shook. And the constitution itself was turned into a weapon to suppress the voices of the people. If you look at it, the protest that was held in 1975 by Jayaprakash Narayan, the emergency was declared the very same night on grounds of internal disturbances.
Yes.
And this is how fragile the government was to criticism at that time.
And won't you think it was a very... Yeah, Joel, continue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Minaj, but I would like to differ on your point is that this was not an emergency planned on a particular... It was actually a months long of preparation and planning with regard to, because Madam wanted to save her seat, and I'm not referring to her name because I'm self-censoring myself, just like the newspapers of those times who are not allowed to mention about Madam or about the emergency particular, because you know what she did? She just cut the electricity supply into the publication, and they were allowed to to publish about the emergency. It's literally cutting the voice of the media. And then you're talking about free speech today and trying to compare it to today's times. Are we really in the emergency period? Because frankly speaking, we are not. But then I would like to hear a point from Maria with respect to the same on the emergency as well.
Yes, Joel. So when you actually speak about the situation that we suffered in 1975, which was ultimately, a well whitewashed propaganda, that actually calls me back to what had happened during the British era in our country. I mean, very specifically, how our nationalist leaders were suppressed, especially when it comes to the civil liberties of the individuals by that time, where all these nationalist movements were like, very practically under the name of legislations got suppressed very particularly. So even after we got independent, even after we regained all these liberties, it was quite sad to, get into a situation like that of in 1975. And do you think the situation has got a big change even now? What do you guys think on the present situation?
Well, I believe that we've come a long way. As a society, we've grown and we've become more tolerant to dissent. We've become more tolerant to opposition. We've become more tolerant to criticism. And I feel like, yeah, in comparison to how we were 200 years ago and how suppressed we were then, of course, you need some restrictions on speech. But, I feel like we have come a really long way in that regard.
This is Minaj typically being very diplomatic in his answer, that you would expect emergency. And in the subsequent events, the All India radio and playing all speeches of Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi all day, speaking in praise of the 20-point programs on AIR and television, it really reminds us of the Nazi propaganda through the movies and radio, or even the large communist propaganda of the Soviet Russia. And her loyalists trying every trick up their sleeve to really to really make lose the credibility of the several institutions. Typical Napoleon and the dogs of like the Animal Farm, and the likes of the Nazi Germany, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And also would like to point out several very fascinating facts also in the emergency. So there was this article in one of the newspapers, a very funny instance about, in the obituary section of the paper, it mentioned death of democracy. That is in direct reference to the state democracy. Subtle notion with regard to the same. And when you're talking about the emergency, let's not forget the number of movies which were banned. You had Andi, you had Kissa Kursi Ka, and also Sanjay Gandhi on his spree of doing his favorite Maruti car project, and the infamous Nasbandi also, literally and metaphorically also. And also, which really makes you want to question is that, like, we in that time we had really elected democratically a prime minister, and was that time the reincarnation of the colonial forces of India, the fascism at its peak, I must say. Like, there's a very famous quote which everyone likes to point out now: "Angrez chale gaye, par apna aulad yahan chhod diye." We have still not risen up from our imperialistic mindset and thought process and the freedom of press. Especially, you had like several papers like the Indian Express and the Statement, who were one of the only few who stood up to the government. And who can forget Ramnath Goenka also? And also, do you guys have anything to say about today's times with regard to our media? Is our media become very complacent like the time? Is there only the propaganda which we see, or is there some real news which we are seeing? Like,
Joel, I think, yeah, you have a point there, but I also agree with what Minaj said just before. I mean, when we actually discuss about the situation that we had in 1975 and the situation we had during the British era, we have definitely come forward with a lot of distance. We have covered a lot of distance as we are in the situation now. But still, there is existence under the within the constitution, like we are being prevented to speak, because as three of us know, and as everybody know, right of free speech is not an absolute right, which is quite, it's quite substantial. It's not an absolute right, and being not an absolute right, it is, it has to face some reasonable restrictions. So don't you guys think that what we are today, are those restrictions that are made today are reasonable in nature? Like, are we in a state to question the reasonability of restrictions that are imposed on the free speech?
Well, yes, I completely concur with you because, like I said earlier, we have come a long way in terms of the freedoms that we have today. But, in addition to that, I would also like to say that the restrictions we have today are very, although written down in black and white, they, when it comes to their interpretation and their application, there is a sort of, ambiguity in that, on which cases decide to get the laws applied and which cases don't. So what is your take on that? Do you feel like there's a bias of such in the application of these laws?
What is the comparison? Yeah, is there any comparison with America and other countries with their legislation on free speech? Are there any?
Well, yeah. If you look at America, America has a complete allowance of free speech. Almost everything is allowed. If you look at the comedy shows and the stand-up comedy shows in America, they heavily criticize the government and they make a mockery of the government. They make a mockery of Trump. And yeah, you can see that they're more tolerant towards speech, you can say. And on the other hand, if you look at the model followed in Europe, free speech is allowed, but there are several restrictions which is closely related to India. So in my opinion, the latter is more conducive because it prevents any sort of hate speech or, uh, incitement of any violence towards a particular community.
Minaj, the word that you used just now, could you please repeat it again?
I said hate speech.
Just before, you said incitement, right?
Incitement of violence, yes.
Absolutely. I was actually coming to that point, like it's one of a very, a very prominent thing or a pertinent thing to discuss when it comes to free speech. That is, there's an ultimate distinction between what you call as advocacy and what you call as incitement. And this was laid down in none other than the case law Shreya Singhal case of 2015, which was with reference to the US Supreme Court case of Brandenburg case of 1969, where they had sought down a very clear distinction on what is incitement and what is advocacy. So a very recent incident, I think just a few days back, and still the wave of the same is going across the country, on a Twitter post posted by civil rights lawyer Prashant Bhushan, which was again tend to be an incitement rather than advocacy. Do you have a say on this issue, where what is advocacy and what is incitement, by analyzing the Twitter posts posted by Mr. Prashant Bhushan?
Say, one of the institutions which we hold in high regard, irrespective of governments, is the Supreme Court, is the judiciary. But we would also like to point out that, in particular to the contempt of court case of Prashant Bhushan, it was not just Prashant Bhushan who had pointed it out. Even several former Supreme Court justices as well, especially, can I point to you, Markandeya Kaju also had pointed out with regard to the corruption in the judiciary.
Yes.
Don't you
Yes.
feel that revelation about the same by subsequent lawyers and judges as well? What do you have to say, Minhaaj, Maria? What do you have to say? Since you guys have,
Which brings me to the point I made earlier. Although there is a law and a certain procedure that must be followed in situations like this, the applicability differs. Certain cases and certain instances are given more, more importance, and certain cases are just, left to the side. And that is the bone of contention, I feel, in today's world.
And I want you guys to also, infer into the conclusions or the statements made by the Supreme Court while pronouncing the judgment, that there's an exception under the Contempt of Court Act, which states any allegation against an individual judge or an individual judge won't amount to contempt of court. So if you look into the tweets posted by Mr. Prashant Bhushan, one of the tweet heavily, or the word used was grossly condemned CJI, Sharath Arvind Bobde, Justice Sharath Arvind Bobde, and the other Twitter post stated something, a very general statement that almost you will find in a grosser tone, like in everywhere in Twitter, which stated about the 4 Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, who were in role 6 years back. So don't you think the second tweet from his side was something that would have amounted to contempt of court, which created the so-called incitement towards public, as the Supreme Court has just concluded?
Well, in response to the question you just posed, if this particular case has been treated as contempt of court, then all those matters that preceded should be treated in the same light, don't you think? And the previous judges, then anything and everything against the court should be taken into consideration as a contempt of court, right?
I think, Minaj, I have an answer to that because I just went through a lot of, notes that stated about these issues, where what the undertaken by the judges previously was referred to as fair criticisms of the judiciary on the judiciary, while what Mr. Prashant Bhushan has said was actually categorized as, incitements from out of disrupted facts. So don't you think definitely fair criticism and incitements over disrupted facts do differ? Doesn't isn't that the same when it comes to?
But again, if you look at it, there is a difference in the terms of how they've been interpreted, right?
Yes,
And
sure.
that's where the problem lies.
Exactly. So I think three of us equally at the end of the day agree to the fact that what is all about dissent, what is all about fair criticism, free speech and all are still a gray, a big gray patch in the entire, right to freedom. Don't you think so? It's a grayer portion right away?
I would
Indeed, yes. In terms of application and interpretation, it is a gray area. Despite having several laws, despite having several restrictions, international governance. For example, if you look at the ICCPR, the ICCPR also says that freedom can only be restricted by law, and necessary restrictions should be imposed on when a speech is made against the rights or reputation of others, or for protection of national security and public order, etc. So if you can see that all the countries unanimously agree on certain restrictions being imposed on free speech, why is there a question now? Why is there a difference in the interpretation now?
on out even Kapil Sibal has termed it as the contempt power being used by the court as a sledgehammer, and that history would judge the courts for having let us down. Now, I hope I shouldn't be saying that to the same with regard to Section 66A of the IT Act, which was brought by
Yes.
the previous regime, which was very vague and really absurd with regard to its provision with regard to what is annoyance and what is not. In continuation, we would now it be like trying to discuss about the sedition laws of our country, or in particular to Section 124A of IPC. Like, is it really a necessity in our country, in a democracy like today, since we are progressing over time? And even Bapuji, Mahatma Gandhi also had been charged of sedition.
Yeah, under
Even
sedition
Bal
law.
Gangadhar,
Yes.
yeah, Bal Gangadhar Tilak also was of sedition. Isn't it really sad that we are still on with the same archaic law? Shouldn't there be a change, or is it being used by politicians very crookedly?
Joel, before getting into the sedition law or before getting into the UAPA in particular, I mean, which is a very vast topic to be touched, and we got to extract the core of free speech part or hate speech part from it. Much before that, I think, as we discussed Mr. Prashant Bhushan's case, we're slowly being brought to the situation or the usage of online platforms today, aren't we? The intermediary platforms, the online platforms through which almost every communication is being made possible today, especially at the state like we all are being, work at home, work from home, and all have become the new fashion. So I think we must not forget to discuss about the recent allegation that was raised against one of the biggest platform, Facebook, where as in Facebook was with the support in the support of the ruling party with respect to the post that came up in the platform. So don't you think online platforms do have a great role with respect to the freedom of speech and expression of individuals when we consider today's situations of the changing worlds right away?
Well, in my opinion, these content platforms arbitrarily decide what stays and what doesn't stay. If you look at it
Exactly.
recently, there was that incident in Bangalore with regard to the Naveen case, it's and the arson that happened in Bangalore. And yeah, because and in my opinion, these social media platforms should not interfere and arbitrarily decide what stays and what doesn't. In my opinion, the laws of the country should govern these social media sites too, and the social media sites should merely act as a facilitator to give the evidence to the proceedings or the trial proceedings. And yeah, that's what I feel is necessary, because if you allow the social media platforms to censor what they feel is necessary, then they will become a tool and be used in a very political manner.
See,
What do you think?
what I kind of agree on what you're trying to point out, that social media should pass it on to the law, to the agencies with regard to any kind of post which is insightful or harmful. But there shouldn't there be some kind of policy or a regulation which actually looks upon if there are any violations being done? Because let's not forget, in a city like Bangalore is a cosmopolitan city. It's not like the typical conservative city, and we are progressing with our times. And it's really hard to see that in my city that violence of this sort over a minuscule or over a minor post can cause hatred or violence. Is your faith in your religion so feeble and so meek that you need to go get to the streets and protest or to join in violent ways? But I feel that in particular to the Bangalore incident, and you cannot attribute the tweet or the post alone to the violence being done. It also is the psychological impact it has happened, because as per several reports, several of these people are unemployed, and we're talking about unemployment rates in our country, especially during the corona time, and the insanity which has brought them towards to come to the such violent ways. And also with regard to it's a really striking revelation that a platform like Facebook is it's according to the Wall Street Journal and several other papers which have also pointed out the same, that is social media being used as a tool of hate. Now let's not forget, with regard to the several comedians who have been targeted over their comedy tracks. Now these have been recorded many months ago, and during the COVID situation, it has resurfaced again. Why? Because people are at homes and they're trying to check out the content. Now, I agree that you should not, in your act should not cause any kind of hatred or violence or any kind of, you can't demean a god, or you cannot demean an icon in a very bad way. But to counter that, you try to engage in violence, or you try to issue rape threats or death threats to that person, and sitting in your car. Now, I think I don't find a difference between a news anchor or an AC studio and a person sitting in an AC car with his video facing, because both of them are spreading hate in the end of the day. Because these are this very cheap method of trying to get publicity, wherein these people come on video and try to issue threats, and it takes a lot of time for these media platforms to actually go and stop, to go and delete or to block their accounts. Don't you feel that there should be some kind of self-regulation also on platforms like Facebook and Instagram and others? Because it's a really sad situation that we are getting violence as a means to keep others
Joel,
quiet.
yeah, Joel, there in the point you said, like I think I have 2 points to say in that. One was regarding the Bengaluru riots. Like it is not at all justifiable for the riot that they've got broke out by the time, and all those issues created are not at all justifiable in a society like that of ours. However, do you think that was the whole breakout was just out of a single social media post, or was the incitement based on a single social media post posted by the nephew of the MLA, as the fact suggests? That's the first question. Like a lot of people have the same question. Was that the insecurity among the category of people who came up and broke the riots that had been existing, which actually got developed gradually due to a lot of incidents? That was the first part I had to tell. Secondly, with what Minhaaj and you were pointing out regarding the media censoring, especially when it comes to social media, there comes a word called censoring. The arbitrary nature, I think, chosen by the social media platforms, including as allegedly by Facebook also, where they have a tendency to keep a few posts on the social media and to remove a few posts or their accounts from the social media.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So do you think, who are they to decide, or who have to actually, decide upon the, the persistence of these kind of posts on social media?
Well, I still stick to what I've said earlier. Social media platforms should not be given this power to, decide what stays and decide on what doesn't stay, because at the end of the day, they aren't the judiciary. They aren't the bodies that decide what is good for the greater good. And like I said, they should merely facilitate providing evidence to the law enforcement agencies, and the decision should be taken by them. Because once we give this power to the social media platforms and the content platforms, they have this sense of executionary power, you know,
True.
and they decide what stays and what's visible to the rest of the public, and that itself raises a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Joel,
So
do you have a say on that?
yeah, I agree with your point, but I still feel that when you're touching, you're crossing the limit. And I mean limit not in the way of censoring your free speech. If it's causing some kind of hatred or some kind of annoyance to someone, which is really which is really detrimental to that person, I don't think you should. I think that platforms like Facebook or Instagram should actually look into it, because uh, you are seeing brazen amount of and see, with regard to the Bangalore incident, just by a single post you won't, if you won't resort to violence. That means you just check the YouTube comment section of several of the YouTubers, or even other platforms. You'll always see several comments against minorities, or against
True,
Muslims, or
true.
against Christians. So
Agree.
I have pointed out earlier as well, it's not entirely on the base of a post. And we cannot really get into it because we don't have enough information with regard to the same.
Minaj, do you have a say on that?
Hello,
Yes.
we just cut that part out.
What happened to Minaj? Was he being stopped by someone? Why did he say cut? Who is trying to put pressure on his free speech? To find out, tune into our next episode of the podcast on Spotify, Anchor, iTunes, YouTube, and IGTV. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Coming soon, second episode.